And this should not come as a surprise. Since ancient times, diasporas have been vital conduits for diplomacy and the projection of influence. The ancient empires in Anatolia and Mesopotamia used diaspora figures as ambassadors and business agents, strategically intermarrying them with neighboring civilizations. The great historian Arnold Toynbee wrote praisingly of the Roman marchmen. Marchmen were the citizen sentries who advanced to the frontiers of Europe and beyond to expand the Roman Empire. Moving into the more contemporary world, a century ago, Sun Yat-sen toured the United States to raise money for the Nationalist Party, and he declared, "The diaspora is the mother of the revolution." In the mid-20th century, it was Nazi geographers who coined the phrase Lebensraum. What did it mean? It was meant to be a space for the German population and diaspora to spread eastward. The diaspora that they wound up propelling outward was that of European Jews, who have become so influential in Europe, North America, and beyond. Moving really into the immediate past, after the Cold War, remember it was the Balkan diasporas in Canada and elsewhere that helped to fuel the ideological and ethnic divides and provide funding for some of the conflict that tore apart Yugoslavia. At the same time, Baltic diasporas, those from Northern Europe, successfully lobbied the United States and other countries to expand NATO, the NATO alliance. Around the same time, Indian political parties began fundraising in the United States and began to lobby heavily for the US-India nuclear agreement and other kinds of diplomatic issues. Lebanese political parties now pay the airfare to fly Lebanese Canadian citizens to Beirut to vote in elections. So from Northern Ireland to Myanmar, the examples of diasporas actively shaping, interfering, and otherwise influencing politics in multiple nations goes on and on. But bringing it back to the core issue of geopolitics, very few stories of emerging markets becoming great powers today would be complete without the diaspora dimension. Let's take the example of the Persian Gulf states, particularly the United Arab Emirates. As its economic fortunes have taken off, particularly in the last decade, and its skylines have reached the heavens, the population of the UAE has grown over fivefold, from just over 1 million to close to 9.5, 10 million today. And over 85% of that population is South Asian. Dubai has been built by South Asian labor and is a second home for so many South Asians. That fact has, of course, led to jokes about how South Asians seem to do better outside the continent than in it, or do better for others than for their own homeland. But fortunately, that's starting to change, as evidenced by the great South Asian entrepreneurs present in the region and in the diaspora today. At the same time, though, very seriously, it raises important questions about what constitutes citizenship and belonging in nations that are such demographic patchworks due to the presence of diasporas. I believe we have to move away from strict notions of citizenship towards a much more flexible term that I call stakeholdership, in which we recognize the reality that whether or not someone is a citizen, is secondary to the stake that they've created, acquired, and contributed to their adopted homes. And this notion of stakeholdership is just one example of a new vocabulary that we need to understand 21st century socio-political and economic dynamics in an age in which diasporas are so important. Because as that face of globalization, what has happened in the process is that globalization has disrupted the relationship between territory and identity. We're really no longer limited to just one identity. Technology allows for multiple ones. For the 25 million or more South Asians outside of the subcontinent, that means not just being agents of the home nations or servants of the adopted ones, but creating some new pattern of community, Part of what gives South Asians in North America such confidence is not just their concentrated wealth and status, but that they can now see themselves not just as minorities, but as part of a powerful global majority, which is members of the emerging markets of the so-called, what used to be called the South, that actually make up most of the world's population and represent the world's fastest growing economies. So rather than thinking of the South Asian diaspora in a hub and spoke sort of manner, it's much more like cloud computing. And it's a very big cloud, of course, with servers in over 100 countries. It's the human embodiment of what the great poet Tagore wrote when he spoke of the banyan tree, that to know the greatness of the banyan tree, one has to study not just its trunk in its own soil, or its stem in its own soil, but to look to see what foreign soils it has reached. And so these diaspora groups can have an autonomous strength and set their own agendas in both locations, at home and abroad. They can reshape what South Asianness actually is. There are no central rules for governing this mass of diasporic humanity, the South Asian diaspora that spreads around the world, nor are there rules for governing the way the Chinese or other diasporas function. There's no unidirectional cultural flow anymore. If you look at the self-interpretation of South Asian culture that takes shape in art, music, cinema, and literature that is produced by diasporas, you immediately see that these works simply would never have come to exist. They would not have taken shape in their unique forms were it not for the diaspora experience. And so last decade's debates about whether or not the success of diasporas threatens the centrality of nations like India has been replaced by a far more constructive conversation in which, because of technology, there's no competition anymore between the diaspora space and the homeland. They both inhabit a shared cultural and economic realm that is positive sum and that is expanding. Ask yourself this for the case of India. From the 1998 nuclear tests until today, what has done more to make India a great power in the eyes of the world? Nuclear weapons or the diaspora? I think the answer is very clear. The other case, an even larger one really, of the role of diasporas is China. And it really brings to mind, or really is an embodiment of some of the more recent economic literature that points to how diasporas add to the animal spirits of economies, helping them gain an edge with leading sectors, information technology, nanotechnology, and others. This has happened in India and China and elsewhere. Now, the contribution of the 50 million Chinese overseas citizens, many of whom in the Pacific Rim, has been larger than any other single force. The Chinese overseas diaspora is the largest foreign investor in China itself, particularly those based in Taiwan, Hong Kong, and elsewhere in the Pacific Rim. And so from the standpoint of the financial sector, the enrichment, the strengthening, the rising power status economically of countries like China and India has depended a tremendous amount on the role of the diaspora. It's already been mentioned that tens of billions of dollars worth of diaspora deposits rest in Indian banks. Chinese and Indian banks now facilitate family accounts so that cross-border families can share assets. In the case of India, the Indus entrepreneurs and the IIT alumni are highly organized diaspora networks that pool money and launch projects in the region on a regular basis.